I teach English at Barnard College, and I've been for the last couple of years preoccupied with the Palestinian question, trying to understand the Palestinian question, the roots and causes of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and the relationship of the US and Israel. That's how I came to the question. I'm originally from the area, so helping me understand some of the things that I've experienced living there.
You've just finished this program, this lecture by Noam Chomsky that was delivered in 1989, a long time ago, over 15 years ago. What do you think were the key points that people can learn from this lecture, looking back 15 years, that Chomsky talks about that are relevant to understanding the conflict today?
Well, I thought it was a very important lecture, still very relevant to understanding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Arab-Israeli conflict for that matter, and more broadly, the US role in the region. Two main things that come to mind that I always felt were generally Chomsky territory, as it were, in trying to understand the international relations of the Middle East. One very important dimension of the argument has always been for him to try to understand the main cause of why the US is in the region. Why the US came into the region, why the US has been involved in the region since 1940. And I think this has always been his emphasis, that the US is there to control oil. Not to control oil because it needs it, but to control oil because it, using that, tries to determine the policies and the accumulation strategies of its allies, Japan and Europe. So that has been there and constant since the 1940s. Out of this primary, initial, foundational US cause for US presence in the region comes out hostility to nationalist regimes. And from that period, from 40s, 50s onwards, when the older, greater powers evacuate the conflict, the area, the US moves more in and gets more and more hold of the region. A very important indicator is the 1956 war, and in relationship to the behavior of the Israelis, it's a very important indicator if we compare it with the 1967 war. In 1956, Israel attacked Egypt in coordination with England, the UK, and France. And Eisenhower's response was very clear and very important, and he said Israelis should evacuate Sinai. And of course, Ben-Gurion started shouting about Al-Arish being Jewish land and all of that, and Eisenhower was very firm. He said Israel has to leave Sinai. Israel left Sinai and left Gaza as well. Exactly because Israel attacked without either prior US knowledge or without US consideration in order to serve other US allies in the region. The 1967 war was done with US coordination and with a green light from the US, exactly in order to serve US interests in the region. So it was much more in alliance with the US then. Much more in coordination with the US then, cemented later on the US-Israel alliance. Now, it's important in relationship to oil because that 67 war, very importantly, ended up crushing Arab nationalism politically. So out of the oil concerns comes a hostility towards the US, and into that is inserted the Israeli role. Israeli role, I think, foundationally, very important, is premised on what Chomsky says, very importantly, the strategic asset thesis, that Israel has played since 1967 a strategic role in US regional policy. And the most crucial part of it is not in protecting oil. I don't think that's what Israel is there for. I think the US in and of itself can do that on its own much more important than US directly. First Iraq War is an example of that. The second Iraq War, the 2003 war, is an example of that, where the US doesn't actually need Israel to actively protect or go in and control the oil itself. What the US needs Israel for is to try to crush Arab nationalism, to try to push back any kind of Arab radicalism or any kind of move to independent political regimes, popular political regimes. So to keep the Arabs ruled by, maintain authoritarian elite rulership over the Arabs, which was very, very amenable for US primacy in the region. Saudi Arabia is a very favorite regime for the US. The Egyptian regime, after Sadat's peace treaty, becomes a very important regime in that sense. The Jordanian regime has always been important. One thing you can say about this, which Chomsky has always emphasized, is that the Egyptian case is a very interesting case in its changing response to the US in the region. After the 1967 war, something very interesting happens in Egypt. Egypt recognizes that for it to return the Sinai region and for it to return its national rights violated by Israel in the 1967 war, it has to not pursue its Soviet alliance, but actually move towards the US. And there are peace overtures by Sadat, very importantly, from the early 1971 onwards. Endless overtures, endless interviews saying that if we don't return our lands by peace with Israel, we are interested in peace, we're happy to settle the conflict based on land for peace formula, we're happy to settle with the Israelis. The Israelis, of course, refused that. If we don't get that by the peace route, we will do it by force. And that's what happened in 1971 onwards, and by 1973, Egypt initiated the war in order to return Sinai in coordination with Syria. Syria wanted to return the Golan Heights. It is then that the US awakens and realizes that Egypt is a very important strategic. It takes a war for Kissinger to recognize how significant and how really ruffled and angry Egypt was about the Israeli occupation of Sinai. So Egypt can force the US by the power of war to change its policy over Sinai. So the US comes in after the 1973 war and tries to settle the Egyptian-Israeli conflict very specifically. And Sadat comes in to effectively say that if Israel if Israel returns Sinai, we will have peace with the Israelis. And that way, recognizing that he could only get Sinai back not through the Soviets but through the Americans. The other interesting issue about the Egyptians, and there's an interesting comparison with the Palestinians over this issue, is that because Egypt is such a powerful state, Egypt could actively do it by force. Right? It could attack Israel. It could try to get back its national rights by force. For the Palestinians, because they're so weak, because they don't have the capacity that the Egyptian state has, they couldn't force themselves onto the attention of the Americans for them to sufficiently put pressure on Israel to settle the conflict. The problem of capacity or lack of capacity for the Palestinians has been one of their major problems in the region. That's why Egypt can return its rights and the Palestinians couldn't.
Were there some other key issues that you saw coming up in this early lecture that you think are relevant to the discussion of the issue today?
The lecture was given in 1989. This was the time when the Palestinians were in active, spontaneous and popular revolt against the Israeli occupation. And it brings us back to that very important moment, I think, when the Palestinians were closest to ever trying to achieve national self-determination. What comes out of this moment, mass, again, spontaneous, what Chomsky calls actually a revolutionary mobilization by the Palestinians to overcome their subjugation by the Israelis since 1967. What gradation of Palestinian peace initiative, of Palestinian peace initiative, right? Ratified officially in 1988, in November 1988, and accepted, as he says, on 14th of December 1988. The world is always looking for, they say the Palestinians don't have a Mandela. Right? This is the time, 1998, when they had a Palestinian Mandela. The Palestinians recognized Israel's right to live in peace and security, very important distinction, not recognize Israel's right to exist, but to live in peace and security. Recognized that, became accepted officially the international consensus over resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which they have implicitly accepted, arguably since 1974, when they accepted to build a Palestinian state on any liberated part of Palestine. This was ratified again in 1988. So the parameters, had the US been interested, and had the Israelis been interested, the parameters for settling or beginning to settle the Palestinian-Israeli conflict were there. This is what the Intifada was about. This is what the 1988 peace overtures were about. And the fact that we're still here now and that this hasn't been accepted just shows you the extent to which Israel is completely a rejectionist of Palestinian right of self-determination. And the Americans have been completely rejectionists of Palestinian right of self-determination as well. This is the significant point at which the conflict could have been over effectively. We're talking 20 years ago, if not before. If only for the fact that Israel and the US don't want it to be over. And that this is another important Chomsky emphasis, and that they are the exception in the world. They have always been the two most important countries who rejected the international consensus over the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So they're outside of the international consensus. Most people in the US believe in that consensus. Most people actually in Israel arguably believe that you can only achieve peace with the Palestinians if you return all of the West Bank and Gaza and dismantle a majority of them. In Gaza, certainly, and in the West Bank, less of a majority, but nonetheless a very significant part of Israelis believe that you have to settle the Palestinian-Israeli conflict by evacuating all the settlements, which are perceived to be illegal. This is what the international consensus is about. So the Chomsky lecture brings us to back to this very important point in 1988 and 1989, when peace could have been achieved again, but wasn't, because Israel didn't want to. And the US didn't want to. Now, because the Palestinians were weak in terms of capacity, even their revolt couldn't achieve what a powerful state like Egypt did in 1973, right? What Chomsky talks about is that the US had to adjust its policies, its consistent strain of rejecting Palestinian national determination, by having a dialogue with Arafat. So you have Palestinian Mandela coming into shape in 1988, and the American concession is only to have a dialogue with the Palestinians. Right? That's a very important difference with the South African case. Right? Where the South African case, there was a Mandela, and that generated a completely different set of political outcomes. In the Palestinian case, the Palestinians have always, at least since the mid-70s, that has been the Fatah strain, been interested in settling with the Israelis by having a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, ending the occupation, and beginning to resolve the Palestinian question. It's just the Israelis didn't want that. The Israelis continued to hold on to the West Bank and Gaza, continued to build settlement, continued to expand, continued to exploit water, and are simply not interested in having a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And this has always been the impediment for peace. So Chomsky has always recognized that, and this is very important, and has always, I think a majority of Americans understand that this is what the parameters of the beginning of a just resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli question is about. It's just that the American elites and their cheerleaders in the media don't. That has always been the problem. That has always been why the Palestinian question seems so difficult to talk about in the US, and why the Palestinian question has been completely mystified in the US, talking about either Palestinians as a bunch of terrorists, or either invoking notions of the ancient hatreds between the Jews and the Muslims. These are simply irresolvable. This is just complete nonsense. The conflict is resolvable. It's just that Israel and the US don't want to resolve it, because the Palestinians are too weak enough to enforce a resolution on that.
I wonder if you'd comment on the brief discussion of the concept of Zionism. This is a concept that clearly plays a role in this conflict. But I think for many people, the way that term is bandied about and the lack of understanding of certainly most people, I think, in the United States, what is the history of this concept of Jewish nationalism, what it implied, the doctrine itself, and then how that doctrine literally mapped into the creation of this state and the dispossession of the Palestinian people.
I think there are many strands within the Zionist movement, and that's always been a very important thing to comment about. And Chomsky obviously comes out of, or is interested, or sometimes thinks back to very important humanist, he calls it humanist, somewhat binationalist stand amongst pre-war, pre-1948 Jewish issue. But the people who actively founded the State of Israel, the people who won out within the Zionist camp, were what you can call the labor Zionists, in the group in and around Ben Gurion, who actively founded the State of Israel. And the State of Israel, and this is what, when talking about Zionism in hypothetical terms, it becomes difficult. This is when one has to talk about, and Chomsky does, talk about what Zionism meant in terms of policies. What Zionism meant in terms of policies was the dispossession of the Palestinians. The foundation of the State of Israel involved the end of Palestinian society, effectively. A complete denial of Palestinian self-determination. And what's very unique about Israel and Zionism as a settler colonial ideology is, unlike the South African case, where the South Africans sought to exploit the natives, the Zionists sought to completely dispense with them. They were completely, they sought to expel them. So natives have no place within the structure of the new entity that comes into place with the settler colonial project taking into effect. And that, very importantly, allows for, puts the black South Africans in positions to achieve certain political outcomes which are much more difficult for the Palestinians to do, because they're completely evacuated out of the structure, so they have very little leverage to transform Zionism or Israel from within, like the black South Africans did. So, for example, if it's much easier for the black South Africans to go for a one-state solution, exactly because they're placed within the structure, effectively, let's call it a one-state solution, it's much more difficult for the Palestinians. However desirable it is, it's much more difficult for the Palestinians, exactly because Zionism entailed their expulsion in 1948. And this was one of the foundational moments for the Palestinians. The fact that they were completely cut out of the structure of the new state that came into being based on the destruction of their own society. So part of the problem of Palestinian nationalism is how to substitute for this lack of leverage within the society you're trying to transform. What can the Palestinians do to gain the power and capacity, right? Very importantly, to transform the structures which have entailed their dispossession and which have meant effectively their expulsion. It's a much more difficult national struggle, I think. And the Palestinians have dealt with a much more uncompromising enemy in the form of the Zionists than the black South Africans ended up doing. Facing, I think. So the situation on the ground today, arguably, if we want to keep very briefly to this comparison with South Africa, is much worse than what the South Africans experienced in South Africa before. Exactly because of this foundational difference between the two kinds of settler colonialisms. Now, the other dimension of this Zionism, which was very important, the Zionism that founded the state, was that it was Zionism based on labor movements. That it was Zionism that was pushed through not by Jewish capitalists. Jewish capitalists actually failed in settling Palestine, very importantly. The people who succeeded in settling Palestine were the bureaucracy that ended up organizing the labor organizations in Palestine. So that you have a settler, very uniquely, a settler colonial project being pushed through by labor organizations, the Histadrut and the Yishuv military wing combined together, incorporating into that support from the Jewish capitalists, but the project being driven and organized by this bureaucratic elite through the labor organizations. That, of course, has meant that another important outcome is that there was very little room within Palestine, within pre-1948 Palestine, and afterwards for what you can call cross-national organizations with the Palestinians. That's why the most foundational antagonism between the Palestinians and the Israelis has always been a national antagonism. Room for other kinds of political formations or coordination was very narrow, if not completely unavailable or completely impossible, exactly because of the nature of the Zionist project being driven by the labor organizations. So these are very important features that are specific to Zionists. The other third important feature, one is the dispensability of the natives, the other is being pushed by labor organizations. The third very important feature is that Zionism has been, since its Herzlian days, constitutively aligned with Western imperialists in the region. You couldn't have had a state, a Jewish state in Palestine without the support subsidy of the British. You couldn't have had, arguably, I think, an occupation of the 1967 areas, the Palestinian areas, the West Bank and Gaza, without American support and subsidy for that. So that the Zionist project in foundation and in expansion is premised on Western support and imperial support and sponsorship, right? That's another important feature of Zionism, another important feature of the State of Israel, right? These are things that mark it off as a settler colonialism than from other kinds of settler colonialism. Now, I think one of the interesting and very troubling things about this project, if we look at it in a broader historical perspective, is that the exclusion of the Palestinian natives was attenuated. There was a partial exception to that in the period from 1967 to 1987 in the areas of the West Bank and Gaza, where effectively Israel behaved like an imperial exploitative power, thought to exploit the Palestinian cheap labor. And they were brought into the Israeli market on a migratory daily basis. They were never allowed to stay inside Israel, but they were brought in unexploited. That resulted, very importantly, in the ruptural moment of the Intifada. So when the Intifada happened, exactly because the Palestinians were allowed to inside Israel, exactly because they were the cheap labor of Israel, Israel was very much shaken by the Intifada. It gave them a lot more political leverage when they decided to revolt, their presence within the economy. And what people like Rabin instituted in 1991, and that was officially on the books from March 1993, is a policy of closure, which effectively meant that this partial exception to Zionist dispensability of the natives, being constitutive to Zionism, was ended. And what was brought back in is cutting out of the Palestinians completely from any kind of relationship within the Israeli Zionist structures, labor structures, and other kinds of economic structures, and so forth. That effectively means that from 1993 onwards, the Palestinians, it's much more difficult for the Palestinians to put pressure, any kind of pressure on Israel. Much more difficult for the Palestinians to have any way of access to Israeli society. They were completely cut off, collectively punished. The policy of closure was instituted in 93 onwards. And the Palestinians were in a much weaker position than they were before the Intifada to try to transform Israel. The policy of closure was instituted as a result of the Intifada. This was part of the robust measures, brutal, violent, and bloody, that were instituted by Rabin to try to crush the Intifada. And they became part of what the Oslo framework was about. So that the Oslo moment, actually, very importantly, was not about ending the occupation, was not about Palestinian independence, and these are completely uncontroversial claims. If any survey of the factual records would give you a pretty clear understanding of what Oslo was about. No end of settlements, no end of occupations, no Palestinian state. But where it left the Palestinians, actually, is in a position much closer to Native Americans, where the population is completely dispensable for Israel, lies completely outside of its structures, and therefore extremely vulnerable for transfer, and or extremely vulnerable to being cut off, cantonized, put in Palestinian townships, if you want to call them townships. They're even much worse than townships, put in closed off in zones that are circled around by the wall, so the Palestinians can simply stay there and effectively rot without having any kind of point of pressure, access, or trying to transform Israeli society in a peaceful direction. So the only kinds of comparisons that come into mind, and I think Norman Finkelstein has been very important in raising that issue early on in the first Palestinian Intifada, was now that what the way things are heading for the Palestinians are they're looking more and more like Native Americans.
Well, let's turn then to these two dimensions of how the conflict is, I think, being discussed more and more today. The first is this question of what's the reasonable outcome of a successful solidarity effort with respect to this conflict. The end of the occupation as a first step, but does that occupation end and result in two states? Or does it end in a single state? And as someone like Jeff Halper of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions calls it, the struggle transitions into an anti-apartheid struggle as opposed to an anti-occupation struggle. Or is there some other kind of outcome that looks to be more likely, or that looks to be more feasible and practical as a goal for a liberation struggle in Palestine and Israel?
There are two basic rights, fundamental rights, that Israel denies the Palestinians. One is the right of return, 1948, as a result of the expulsion of around 1 million Palestinians, 850,000 of them. And the second one, which Israel is in violation of, is the right of Palestinians to self-determine, live in freedom in the West Bank and Gaza, so forth, and the occupation. So these are two basic Israeli violations of what we can broadly call Palestinian right to self-determination. I don't think the Palestinians will rest until both these things are rectified. I think it's extremely important now, especially for the Americans, to worry and think about ending the occupation. I think this is one of the most fundamental, crucial, important things to do at the moment. There's nothing more important than trying to push for the American state to stop supporting Israel and to abide by the international consensus over Israel and Palestine, i.e. to end the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and found an independent Palestinian state there. That's primary, important. Nothing, I think, can be done without that. Nothing can be done even towards going for a one-state solution later on. This is primary. Ending the occupation, dismantling all the settlements, abiding by the international consensus. That, I think, is going to be a very long struggle. That, I think, if there's a proper solidarity movement in the US, and if it recognizes that this is one of the most primary and important things to do, that, I think, is a very long struggle. And I don't think it's an easy struggle at all. After that, after the Palestinians lead this, push this through, it's conceivable. It's conceivable that the Israeli society would be much more amenable to notions of living together with the Palestinians, and much more unamenable to rectifying the expulsion of 1948. I don't think the Palestinians can ever be expected to renounce the right of return. I don't think the Palestinians should be asked to do that. I think the Palestinian right of return is foundational. Addressing it, and addressing it justly, is foundational for resolving the Palestinian conflict and for integrating Israelis as a collective into the Middle East. This is one way where we can get to a real historical resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So I don't think primarily now there's a way around ending the occupation, and I don't think there's a way of resolving the conflict without justly addressing the refugee right of return. I think these are primary issues for Palestinians. Where American solidarity movement would come in, I don't necessarily think that the American solidarity movement, I'm fairly sympathetic to one group in the US that says the American solidarity movement shouldn't either enforce opinions over the one state or the two state. I don't think that's a relevant discussion to have in the US, actually. I think what's important is for the American solidarity movement to focus on violation of Palestinian national and human rights. I think that's where the solidarity movement can be most effective and can be most important. The way the Palestinians and Israelis decide to resolve the conflict in and amongst themselves is important. I think they should have opinions on that, but I don't think these opinions should be enforced. I think they should allow for a broad range of opinions over the one-state and two-state solution. Where they can be much more relevant is pushing towards the end of the occupation, is pushing towards the end of violation of Palestinian national rights. However, the Palestinians decide to do that. It's up to them, up to the Palestinians, and up to the Israelis, right? And you know, they should be expected. They shouldn't have opinions about this. Again, the specific institutional framework of resolving the conflict, but they should advocate universal principles of justice, universal principles of equality. I think that is expected and given. Resolving the parameters within those kinds of universal values, I think, is a given for any progressive and radical person. Where we come into problems with the Palestinian question is that there are needless needless and unnecessary divisions over one state or the two states. I don't think this is a productive discussion to have in the US.
If I can pursue that unproductive discussion, at least momentarily, what do you think accounts for, or what do you think a charitable view of the one-state proponents that we're hearing from more and more these days, what do you think propels their interest and advocacy of a one-state solution within the current political context? In other words, if you were to provide a charitable explanation of this new trend in the discussion of this issue, what would that interpretation be?
I think that the attractions for some people, mainly intellectuals for the moment, of the one-state solution in the diaspora, is that it resolves all the problems. It resolves all the outstanding problems. It has the potential to do that between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So it resolves the right of return. It resolves, it brings about the end of occupation, and it allows for people to live in equality and peace and security for the two communities. In and of itself, I don't think anybody should be, any progressive or radical, should be against the one-state solution. The question has always been with the one-state solution whether it's realistic at the moment. And when we start talking about realism, we start talking about politics, what can be achieved now. I think there, the one-state solution comes into problems. I think it's a very important utopian gesture, and I think it's a very important vision to keep for the long-term horizon. But for now, for the Palestinians now who are suffering under the worst kind of occupation in modern times, to start talking about the one-state solution in the American context, for the moment, and the Palestinians haven't won this battle, neither ideologically nor politically. For the moment, the one-state solution in American minds, in American not only elite minds, but in American popular minds, the one-state solution involves the destruction, conceptually, is associated with the destruction of the State of Israel. Until either the solidarity movement or the one-state has managed to de-link these issues or decouple them, then they're still dealing with, for the moment, a lost cause. So every time they invoke the one-state solution, they can be easily accused of seeking to destroy the State of Israel. They have to find a way of resolving that issue. This is an issue for political contestation. It came out, very importantly, in the 90s, talk about the one-state solution. It came out in the 90s because the PLO abandoned the struggle for a two-state solution. The PLO abandoned the struggle for decolonizing the West Bank and Gaza by accepting Oslo. So out of very importantly, out of a history of desperation, the 90s were extremely difficult years for the Palestinians. Extremely difficult years for the Palestinian diaspora and the refugee population, who were completely dispossessed, delegitimized by the agreement. They had no role and no place within the Oslo framework. They were completely forgotten by Arafat and his group. So people started bringing up the right of return and the one-state solution as the one-state solution as a way of trying to unify, bring together, organize the Palestinian diaspora community, refugees. In and of itself, I think it's a very important gesture. I think it's extremely important to organize the Palestinian diaspora, refugees in the Arab world and in the West, to mobilize them to pursue Palestinian rights. They're completely unmobilized now. This is part of the Palestinian catastrophe, that people experience their being Palestinian on an individual or family-based level. All kinds of national organizations that link up Palestinians from all over the world have been completely put to one side as a result of Oslo. So the PLO framework needs to be brought back into place, but brought back into place as a participatory framework and as a democratic framework. Very importantly, where the Palestinians can see it as a platform to voice their dissent from the leadership and to voice their different political programs, to compete and contest over them democratically, and to try to get to consensus amongst the Palestinian community of where the Palestinians as a nation are heading. I think that's still fundamental for the Palestinian diaspora to do. So if talk of the one-state solution produces this mobilization of refugees all around the world, a fabulous outcome, but that needs organizing. That needs grassroots organizing. If the one-staters are going for that, marvelous. I don't think anybody would be unhappy with that. I don't think the Palestinians inside the West Bank and Gaza, who are majority, accept the international consensus, let's say, over Palestine, and by majority accept that the primary, most important thing to do is to end the occupation. And most of the population in Gaza, for example, is a refugee population. There's no sense in which what the refugees want abroad and what outside of Palestine. We're talking about refugees and what they want in Gaza, and what they call for as a primary initial way of resolving the conflict is the end of the occupation. What the one-staters, I think, conflate is or collapse into each other is that they have partly, it seems sometimes in the way they phrase things, or sometimes very clearly in the way Edward Said puts things, is that the occupation, the settlements are irreversible. I don't accept that. I think that's a huge concession for the Palestinians to make. The settlements are reversible. They're reversible exactly because they're illegal. I wouldn't give that away and say and accept it as a fact politically that the settlements are irreversible. No, the settlements are reversible and should be reversed because the Palestinians are law-abiding citizens and should live by international norms of equality and justice. Why should the Palestinians live outside of it? Why should the Palestinians accept the settlement? So there's a kind of despair that comes out of the one-state strand that the situation is completely, what Said's favorite word, invoked by many of the advocates of the one-state solution, the populations are completely intertwined. They live together, there's no way of separating them off. Well, they're intertwined. I don't think they're intertwined at all, actually. If anything, the Palestinians have been cut out of any kind of contact with Israelis, which is what the wall is about. The wall is very much about, not about Israeli security. Even the Israeli government has said that and recognizes it. The wall is about keeping the Palestinians out and keeping the Jews in. This is what the wall is about. It's about annexing more and more land, controlling more and more of the natural resources in the West Bank and Gaza, and cutting the Palestinians off from any kind of contact, both with Jews, Israeli Jews, and with Israel as a state. So in no sense does it make sense to me to talk about the populations as if they're inseparable. The populations are separable. This is what Israel has achieved. This is Israel's apartheid. They are separable, they're segregated, they live in completely unequal conditions. One population is poor, 80% rates of poverty in Gaza, 70% rates of poverty in the West Bank and Gaza, in the West Bank, completely different road system, complete different access to power, different access to goods, different access to resources. One population, as a result of PA corruption and as a result of the failure of Oslo, lives in a completely insecure, occupied situation in the West Bank and Gaza. And another population languishes in semi-luxury, armed to the teeth, ready to shoot at any Palestinian around it, and living the notion of realizing the notion of racist superiority, which is the way settlers live in the West Bank. So this is not an analysis of the situation, of the factual record, which implies any kind of intertwining. Right? This is not basis for building one state. The situation you have now is the basis for building, for continuing the occupation. The situation you have now is basis for the Palestinians, for the Israelis to live like overlords, and for the Palestinians to live like animals for a very long time indeed. This is what the situation you have now. It's no. I don't think it's because of the physical proximity of the Palestinians and the Israelis. I don't think you can read off that a political resolution of a one state. The other part of the difficulty with the one state solution and people who advocate the one state is that nobody wants it on the ground in Israel and Palestine. A majority of Israelis, 99% of Israelis, if you tell them one state, they tell you destruction of the state of Israel. A majority of the Palestinians actually don't want to live with Israelis after having known Israelis for 40 years as occupied. They want to have a chance to build their own state, build their own institutions, without having the Israeli army breathing down their necks. So the majority of Palestinians want an end to the occupation and want to live separate from Israelis. So where is, other than the capacity, the problem of how does one go about getting to a one state, there's also the problem of constituency, which is fundamental. Neither constituencies now want the one state solution. So, that's why I don't think one should go against the one state as an idea. I think the one state as an idea is a great idea. If only the Palestinians and Israelis want it, but they don't want it now. And you have the situation compounded by the fact that the 3.5 million Palestinians live subhuman lives. The question for any political being is, what do you do now to help the Palestinians? How do you alleviate their suffering now? How do you help them achieve part of their national demands now? This is the realm of politics. And now had the one status said, well, this is just cultural ideas, and we're just looking towards the future and thinking in utopian terms, the way Said talked about the one-state solution, that would have been fine. But they're talking about the one-state solution as if it's in the realm of political advocacy. It's not. It's wishful thinking. People have a right to their own wishful thinking. People have a right to dream about resolutions of the conflict. But when you hit the real world, when you hit the notion of what's happening to the Palestinians now, and how does one come to help them, and how does one come to alleviate their suffering, nobody's talking about the one-state solution in Israel and Palestine on the ground. That's part of the difficulty. The attraction, the desirability is immense, but the reality of the idea now, it doesn't have political legs to stand on. One hopes it does one day, but I would argue there's no way of getting there unless you weaken the colonialist impulses in Israel by ending the Israeli occupation. So there's no way around ending the occupation, whichever way you want to go to. You want to go for a one-state or a two-state. Ending the occupation is one of the most fundamental and primary things for Palestinians and people who support them to do now.
I had a conversation with Haider Abdel-Shafi in Gaza over 3 years ago now, in which he provided the example that you talked about of Eisenhower forcing the withdrawal of the Israeli occupation of Gaza. He remembers when the Israeli troop carriers came into Gaza and were in the streets of Gaza, and the Eisenhower administration said, "Get out," and he said the next day they were gone. And of course he told this story because, as so many people like Chomsky and like other analysts have pointed out, if the United States policy were to shift, the occupation could end tomorrow.
Right.
Now, this, of course, for anybody working on this issue, is the key question. Why is U.S. policy the way it is? Why does the United States continue to support, and not just support diplomatically, but of course finance, the expansion of the settlements, the construction of the settlement, the Jewish-only roads, highways in the West Bank? Why is it that U.S. policy has been so difficult to shift on this issue? On the one side, it sure seems as though a settlement in this conflict would reduce tensions, would improve the United States' relations with the surrounding Arab countries, which, as everyone knows, that's where the primary oil resources of the region are. They're not within Israel. So why wouldn't the United States see its interest, or the corporate interests that drive U.S. foreign policy? Why do they not see their interests aligning with a just settlement of this conflict?
Well, the short answer is because Palestinian nationals would win out. And America, very broadly, its policy in the region has always been anti-nationalist. So they would do everything for nationalists not to win out in the region. But there's a complicated question in its relationship to Israel. Part of, the two issues are compounded, in the sense that Israel performs this anti-nationalist role for the US, this regional stabilizing role when it becomes a strategic asset for the US in 1967 and after. And that's a very important foundational moment in solidifying the Israel-US alliance. Now, with that comes, with attacking and crushing Nasser, occupying Sinai, Gaza and Sinai, occupying the Golan Heights, comes occupying the West Bank and Gaza. And that problem continues. So you have a sense in which Israel is there to, as an ally, to perform a certain kind of role for the US. Within that, it gets what it wants. What it wants is what it always wanted is control of the West Bank, very importantly for it in terms of resources and for settlement purposes. There was a moment in 1948. There was a discussion between Ben Gurion and the general of the Yishuv forces, then about whether the time is ripe for moving into the West Bank or not. And Ben Gurion made the decision that the time is not ripe yet. This has always been on the books for the Ben Gurion group. So when the 1967 opportunity presented itself, of course Israel jumped on it. It would roll back Arab nationalism, and at the same time it would gain more control of Palestinian lands, which is what it always wanted since 1948, if not before. So the situation is compounded in the sense that you have the aspect of the Israeli role of serving American regional interests, and within that Israel gets to serve its own interests. Now the question arises is how much out of that is the US committed to the occupation? I think as long as Israel is committed to the occupation, and as long as the occupation is so important for Israel, and as long as Arab states have done, Arab states, not the Arab masses, the Arab states have done very little to punish Israel for occupying the West Bank and Gaza. So as long as there is no contradiction between American oil interests and American support for Israel, then the status quo will continue. In and of themselves, the Palestinians haven't managed to create that contradiction between oil and support for Israel within the US establishment. So the US could, the side of the elite that is happy to support the occupation, the Kissinger side, and what Chomsky talks about, support the stalemate, won out. Exactly because the Palestinians were too weak and the Israelis were extremely strong. And the regional allies, American regional allies, very importantly, Saudi Arabia and then Iran then, and he reminds us very importantly that Iran was an ally up until 1979, did nothing about forcing Israel to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza. Didn't stand with the Palestinians by putting pressure, not just by words. The Arab states in that sense have a lot of capacity to help and aid the Palestinians to enforce the international consensus and end the occupation. This is what they say they do support rhetorically, and they do it rhetorically very importantly because a mass of the Arab populations support the Palestinians over these issues. But they haven't done anything actively to put pressure on the US, to put pressure on Israel, that's the measure really. That's when it becomes a problem for the US, where the US has a situation where its allies in the region are happy to stay in business and happy to promote American primacy in the Gulf, but that would stop unless they pressure Israel and they force Israel to evacuate the West Bank and Gaza. I don't think that has been the case. I think if you look at the historical record, let's take Saudi Arabia, which is a very important state in the region. Saudi Arabia has always been much more concerned with what the king then said in the 70s, in the early 70s, and he said it to Kissinger, and it was published in Israel Studies very recently in the 90s. He was much more afraid of Arab communists and radicals than of the Jews, he said. So that has always been a consideration for the Saudi regime. So there is an objective interest between Arab authoritarian regimes and Israel to keep the Arab population down. So that's very important in determining the relationship towards the Palestinians. That's why the Palestinians have always felt that over the Palestinian question, they're on their own. Exactly because the states rhetorically support them, and they have one initiative after another, including now the peace initiative, the Arab Initiative 2002, being discussed a couple of days ago in Mecca, ratified in Mecca, raised again in 2007, which effectively says we are happy to have peace with Israel if Israel evacuates the West Bank and Gaza, allows for the existence of the Palestinian states, and resolves, abides by UN Resolution 194, which is the right of return for the Palestinians. Now, rhetorically, in and of itself, this is a very important thing for Arab states to say. This is, in fact, the international consensus. The Arab states are not deviating from the international consensus. The question for us to link it up to the US-Israel relationship is how much are the Arab states ready to go against, campaign in support of the Palestinians and to go against the Israelis in the region. How many Israeli ambassadors, Arab ambassadors in Tel Aviv were pulled back as a protest against the occupation? None. How much pressure, material pressure, did Egypt and Saudi Arabia put on Israel through the Americans to evacuate the West Bank and Gaza? None. That becomes part of the question. So what America has realized, if there was hesitation in the 1950s about the fact that if it supports Israel, then it's jeopardizing its interests over controlling oil in the region, the 1967 outcome showed you that you can actually have both, because there is no contradiction between oil and access to oil and supporting Israel. In fact, Americans realized, the American administration realized, for a lot of the things, these two things can go together. Unless the Arab states create a contradiction, I think, or unless the Palestinians create a contradiction, I think these things will continue to go along together. Now, there was a moment, very importantly, that the Palestinians could create a contradiction between these two interests, i.e. when the Palestinians could potentially destabilize what you can call American broad regional interests, and undermine a very important, a very minor but important ally for the American state. This was Jordan, the Black September period in 1970-71. This period just gives you an example of when the Palestinians, if they decide to go for revolution in the region, and if they decide to go for not only safeguarding their rights and realizing their rights, but realizing the rights of the Arab peoples in the region, i.e. if the Palestinians could utilize themselves as a spearhead towards Arab revolution and Arab democracy, they are seen to be as a regional threat. And they had to be crushed then. And they were crushed by the Jordanian regime, very brutally crushed. And they were expelled into Lebanon. Israel was ready to intervene if it was necessary. America was ready to intervene if it was necessary. The Soviet Union actually wasn't really interested in supporting the Palestinians then. A host of Arab regimes ended up abandoning the Palestinians then. Nasser had to watch it. He tried to intervene later on to stop the bloodshed, but he couldn't stop it. Saudi Arabia was in support of crashing Palestinian radicals. So that moment in the early 70s just gives you an extent to which when the Palestinians could have overcome their weakness structurally and regained their capacity to influence regional developments and to overturn the authoritarian regime which are allied to the US. And they had to be crushed then. So it just shows that when there is a potential contradiction between supporting Israel and oil, when there is the specter of that, it becomes a problem for the US. And the Palestinians had to be dealt with and had to be crushed to eliminate any kind of instability in the region. Never again did the Palestinians come close to undermining US primacy in the region. So one lesson for the Palestinians, I think, to remember, very important lesson, is that let's put it mildly, let's put it simply. If they want to regain all of their national rights, not just part of their national rights, they have to principally pursue a policy of anti-imperialism in the region. They cannot really accommodate with American imperialist interests in the region. They wouldn't be able to achieve their full rights. From that strand of thinking, resolving the Palestinian question involves rolling back US imperialism in the region and freeing up the Palestinians, helping them gain the support of Arab masses, the capacity of Arab masses, not only to regain their power in helping the Palestinians overcome the occupation, but to help them as well in regaining the right of self-determination. That revolutionary moment in the 1970s is now gone and past, but it's an important lesson, historical lesson, to remember for the Palestinians and to think about, that there is no way through the White House to regain Palestinian national rights. One has to have a complete rejection of American foreign policy in the region to try to begin to rectify the Palestinian question and begin to achieve justice for the Palestinians. That's why the whole PLO Fatah clique of going through the White House, beseeching and begging your way to some of your rights will end up in failure. It will make very little difference in terms of realizing Palestinian rights in the region. If the Palestinians want to realize their right, if they want to live in justice, if they want to achieve their national self-determination, if they want to achieve their right of return, they have to, again, I think of themselves as revolutionaries in the region. The conditions now are different. There are no more radical, socially radical movements in the region. So it's a completely different time. The only active, mobilizing, organized group in the region, unfortunately, for the Arab masses, are the Islamic groups. So we're talking about a completely different time. But in the early 70s, it's an important lesson to remember. And there are lessons for us these days to keep and to abide by, I think. And these are the lessons not only of pushing for democracy in the Arab world, real and proper democracy, where authoritarian regimes are undermined, overturned, and where democratic regimes, popular democratic regimes are instituted. This is an important thing for the Palestinians, because then they can gain more and more support over the Palestinian question. But also for the Palestinians to remember that Washington has always been divisive in its influence in the region. And Washington has been consistently against the Palestinian right of self-determination. And this, again, Chomsky reminds us. This has been a consistent policy. There is no reason, if the Palestinians remain weak, disorganized, lacking capacity, there is no reason for the US to feel pity for them and say, okay, we'll help you get your national rights. Why? If America's one of the most important allies, I think Saudi Arabia is the most important ally, but if America's most important military ally in the region, Israel, is so attached to the West Bank and Gaza and wants the occupation so much, why go against it? If the Palestinians are so weak and disorganized and haven't managed to either rupture the regime system in the region or put pressure on the American administration to change its policy. By going to America, begging America, going to the White House, seeking access to it, that can only mean that the Palestinians are more and more dependent on American policy in the region. That can only mean they will get less and less out of the Americans.
We've been talking for about an hour, but there are two different topics that I want to wrap up on. You've talked about U.S. Foreign policy goals and the degree to which supporting the Israeli continued occupation has not put those policy goals at risk. But on the other side of the balance as well is a very active lobby. AIPAC, or more broadly speaking, what we can call the pro-Israel lobby, is clearly at work in this country. It's interested and active on particular congressional races. It's interested and active in terms of the kind of news reporting that goes on, conditioning, pressuring editors who publish a particular report that they find is too critical of Israel or too sympathetic to a Palestinian point of view. It's active across the political landscape here in the United States. How do we fit that into this question of the difficulty of changing U.S. foreign policy with respect to this issue? Is it a very important part of that? Is it an important obstacle, or is it something that is happening on the side?
I think, to clarify the lobby issue, I think it's a very important discussion to have in the US. And it was generated by the Walton Mearsheimer article. More and more people are coming into this discussion. And I think it's a very worthwhile discussion to have in the US. One difficulty I have is to claim that American foreign policy in the Middle East is being determined by a small group of people called the lobby, especially the pro-Israel lobby. So that American foreign policy in the region seeks to effectively achieve Israeli political goals in the region, and this being the most important and primary aspect of the policy. I think this is, again, I don't think it's a theoretical question. I think this is an empirical question. I think what one has to look at is, historically, is to see, this is the way to measure the problem, every time there's a contradiction between American foreign policy and Israeli and what the lobby wants, who wins out? And I think it's safe to say that when these things are contradictory, these things are not always, not at all contradictory, not necessarily contradictory, but when a contradiction arises, who wins out? Let me give you a recent example. The China deal that Israel entered into, and America was extremely upset about. This is discussed in a very important book by Tanya Reinhardt called The Roadmap to Nowhere. The China deal was taking place when Walton Mearsheimer wrote the article. The China deal gives you a very clear indication that when there's a contradiction between what the US wants and what Israel wants, when these things are contradictory, they don't converge. Mostly they converge because Israel and the US are allies. Israel is subordinate, is there to serve US interests, but there's an alliance there, which is why there's convergence of interest. This is what the alliance is based on. But when there's a conflict of interest, American objectives are always primary. The China deal is a clear indication of that. When Israel tried to do some work on drones that were returned from China, there was a China deal between Israel and China over selling them some drones. Part of the contract was that the Chinese would return the drones after 2 years, and the drones would be fixed up, updated by the Israelis, and then returned to China. This was taking place exactly at the time, 2003, 2004, 2005, exactly at the time that Walton Mearsheimer were thinking about this issue. The China deal, what the US insisted on then was that Israel not return these drones to China because they were against American strategic global interests. And this was the outcome of the conflict, because the US instituted, people don't talk about this, a strategic boycott of Israel for 1 year. There were end of contacts, end of cooperation on all military aspects, major military cooperation between the Pentagon and the Defense Ministry in Israel until that issue was resolved. Imagine a 1 year boycott between allies. Where was the lobby then? This is clearly, for the Israelis, an issue of Israeli national interest. Israel was interested in sending back the drones. It was committed contractually to do so, and it lost, as a result of the American no, $300 million. The lobby didn't say one whimper about the China deal because it was so clearly against American foreign interest in relationship to China. So what the outcome of it was that the person who was committed to the deal, most committed to the deal in the Defense Ministry, in the Israeli Defense Ministry, was fired. The ambassador, the Israeli ambassador in Washington stood against the Israeli Defense Ministry and supported the American administration over this and got the person fired. And America wanted to do even more than that. It wanted to push through the Knesset a vote, a law instituting that Israel will never again go against American global interests, will never again sell China parts of weapons or weapon parts without prior American agreement. They wanted to push that through the Knesset. Again, not one whimper about this in the lobby. So when you have a clear situation of conflict of interest, American interests are primary. Now, is there a conflict of interest over the Palestinian question? If one looks at the US-Israel relationship and the lobby issue through the prism of the Palestinians, it's distorted. It seems as if the lobby determines policy over the Palestinians, but the Palestinians are not strategically significant in the region, nor are they destabilizing American presence in the region, nor are they undermining American interests in the region. They're doing nothing to do that politically. So there's in no sense a contradiction between what America wants and what Israel wants over the Palestinian issue. So the Israelis, it seems, have a lot of leeway within that to do what they want. You know, this is the nature of being powerless, disorganized, and irrelevant for the Palestinians. So it seems over the Palestinian question that the lobby has a lot of power. But exactly because the Americans are not really chuffed about this issue that much. Until some Arab regimes are chuffed about it and want to see some kind of movement over the peace process. When that is the case, then, you know, rice is sent over and one carne entrance is opened or closed in Gaza immediately, which takes months and months of negotiating and problems with the Palestinians and Israel. In comes rice and just opens the carne report for humanitarian reasons. So there's no question is if the American administration wants to put pressure over the Palestinian issue, it can. It has the capacity to do so. Of course it does. There's no question about that. But does it have the interest to do so? So the thesis that the lobby distorts American interests and slants them towards supporting Israel as against, right, as against their real interest in the region is completely irrational. It's nonsensical to sustain this argument. So they make the argument, for example, just to give you an example of what a good lobby argument is, even though some of them withdraw these claims now. They argue that the 2003 war against Iraq was done in order to serve Israel. If one looks at what the Israelis wanted out of the war, or even what the lobby wanted out of the Iraq war, right? For Israel, the most important problem after 1991 in the region, after the crushing of Saddam, were the Iranians. And now the Iranian nuclear threat. That for Israel was #1 problem. So there's evidence, a recent biography of Sharon, where Sharon said, well, you know, our most important problem in the region is Iran, it's not Iraq. You want to go for Iraq? I don't know, and he said this to Bush, I don't know how you can control the situation in Iraq. Our most important primary objective is to downsize, crush the Iranian regime, to do regime change in Iran. So again, this thesis, even over the Iraqi issues, I think is completely unsustainable. There are clear oil interests, resource interests in Iraq, which Israel has nothing to do with in the region. To say that Israel, that the US, the most important empire the world has ever seen, does things for a small state like Israel is a difficult thesis to sustain, extremely difficult to sustain, especially, this is when the test, especially when there are contradictory interests. So this is my problem with the lobby thesis. I think the lobby is extremely powerful when there is convergence between Israel and American interests. And then the lobby can be seen to be doing many things. But exactly, this is what a lobby does. When there is convergence of interest, the lobby is extremely powerful. When there is no convergence of interest, when there is a contradiction of interest, which are rare, exactly because there is an alliance, the lobby is completely sidelined, which is what happens empirically and in the historical record.
Well, I want to give you an opportunity, if there's something, you know, that we haven't talked about, that in particular a U.S. audience ought to think about, ought to focus on when they think about this conflict.
I think one of the major issues that Americans should think about when it comes to the issues is this whole notion of what the lobby is about. And the lobby lays claims to being friends of Israel. I think this is a very dangerous idea. I think the lobby has only managed to push Israel to become more militarized, more fundamentalist, and this cannot be good for the majority of Israelis. I think people should divorce themselves from this logic of what people who claim that they're friends of Israel are doing. People should think about what the majority of Israelis want over the occupation, and that's still very important, and what the majority of Palestinians want. And people should worry much less, I think, about criticizing Israeli policies. They're clearly in violation of universal standards of justice and humanity, and they're clearly in violation of human rights and international law. So I think people should lose this discomfort about saying anything critical about Israel. As long as Israel behaves this way, as long as any state behaves this way, they should comfortably criticize Israel in the name of not only of justice and equality, but the name of protecting, very importantly, protecting what you can call the majority of people in the region from the Friends of Israel and imperial interests in the region. Let's end with that.
You've been listening to a conversation with Bashir Abu-Manneh, Assistant Professor of English at Barnard College in Manhattan. Professor Abu-Manneh teaches courses in global literature, Palestinian and Israeli literatures, Marxism and post-colonialism. He writes for The Nation magazine, ZNet, and Monthly Review. To find out more about Professor Abu-Manneh and his work, please visit the PDX Justice Media Productions website at www.pdxjustice.org, where we have linked to several of his articles. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
That has been there and constant since the 1940s. Out of this primary, initial, foundational U.S. cause for U.S. presence in the region comes out hostility to nationalist regimes. And from that period, from 40s, 50s onwards, when the older, greater powers evacuate the conflict, the area, the U.S. moves more in and gets more and more hold of the region. A very important indicator is the 1956 war, where, and in relationship to the behavior of the Israelis, it's a very important indicator if we compare it with the 1967 war. In 1956, Israel attacked Egypt in coordination with England, the UK, and France. And the Eisenhower's response was very clear and very important, and he said Israelis should evacuate Sinai. And of course, Ben-Gurion started shouting about Al-Arish being Jewish land and all of that, and Eisenhower was very firm. He said Israel has to leave Sinai. Israel left Sinai and left Gaza as well. Exactly because Israel attacked without either prior U.S. knowledge or without U.S. consideration in order to serve other U.S. allies in the region. The 1967 war was done with U.S. coordination and with a green light from the U.S. exactly in order to serve U.S. interests in the region. So it was much more in alliance with the U.S. then, much more in coordination with the U.S. then, cemented later on the U.S.-Israel alliance. Now, it's important in relationship to oil because that 67 war, very importantly, ended up crushing Arab nationalism politically. So out of the oil concerns comes a hostility towards the U.S., and into that is inserted the Israeli role. Israeli role, I think, on foundationally, very importantly, is premised on what Chomsky says, very importantly, the strategic asset thesis, that Israel has played since 1967 a strategic role in U.S. regional policy. And the most crucial part of it is not in protecting oil. I don't think that's what Israel is there for. I think the U.S. in and of itself can do that on its own, much more important than U.S. directly. First Iraq war is an example of that. The second Iraq war, the 2003 war, is an example of that, where the U.S. doesn't actually need Israel to act in the 73 war and tries to settle the Egyptian-Israeli conflict very specifically, and Sadat comes in to effectively say that if Israel if Israel returns Sinai, we will have peace with the Israelis, and that way recognizing that he could only get Sinai back not through the Soviets but through the Americans. The other interesting issue about the Egyptians, and there's an interesting comparison with the Palestinians over this issue, is that because Egypt is such a powerful state, Egypt could actively do it by force. Right? It could attack Israel. It could try to get back its national rights by force. For the Palestinians, because they're so weak, because they don't have the capacity that the Egyptian state has, they couldn't force themselves onto the attention of the Americans for them to sufficiently put pressure on Israel to settle the conflict. The problem of capacity or lack of capacity for the Palestinians has been one of their major problems in the region. That's why Egypt can return its rights and the Palestinians couldn't.
Were there some other key issues that you saw coming up in this early lecture that you think are relevant to the discussion of the issue today?
The lecture was given in 1989. This was the time when the Palestinians were in active, spontaneous and popular revolt against the Israeli occupation. And it brings us back to that very important moment, I think, when the Palestinians were closest to ever trying to achieve national self-determination. What comes out of this moment, mass, again, spontaneous, what Chomsky calls actually a revolutionary mobilization by the Palestinians to overcome their subjugation by the Israelis since 1967. What validation of Palestinian peace initiative, of Palestinian peace initiative, right? Ratified officially in 1988, in November 1988, and accepted, as he says, on 14th of December 1980. Protect or go in and control the oil itself. What the US needs Israel for is to try to crush Arab nationalism, to try to push back any kind of Arab radicalism or any kind of move to independent political regimes, popular political regimes. So to keep the Arabs ruled by, maintain authoritarian elite rulership over the Arabs, which was very, very amenable for US primacy in the region. Saudi Arabia is a very favorite regime for the US. The Egyptian regime, after Sadat's peace treaty, becomes a very important regime in that sense. The Jordanian regime has always been important. One thing you can say about this, which Chomsky has always emphasized, is that the Egyptian case is a very interesting case in its changing response to the US in the region. After the 1967 war, something very interesting happens in Egypt. Egypt recognizes that for it to return the Sinai region and for it to return its national rights violated by Israel in the 1967 war, it has to not pursue its Soviet alliance, but actually move towards the US. And there are peace overtures by Sadat, very importantly, from the early 1971 onwards. Endless overtures, endless interviews saying that if we don't return our lands by peace with Israel, we are interested in peace, we're happy to settle the conflict based on land for peace formula, we're happy to settle with the Israelis. The Israelis, of course, refused that. If we don't get that by the peace route, we will do it by force. And that's what happened in 1971 onwards, and by 1973, Egypt initiated the war in order to return Sinai in coordination with Syria. Syria wanted to return the Golan Heights. It is then that the US awakens and realizes that Egypt is a very important strategic. It takes a war for Kissinger to recognize how significant and how really ruffled and angry Egypt was about the Israeli occupation of Sinai. So Egypt can force the US by the power of war to change its policy over Sinai. So the US comes in after the 1970s. I teach English at Barnard College, and I've been, for the last couple of years, preoccupied with the Palestinian question, trying to understand the Palestinian question, the roots and causes of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and the relationship of the US and Israel. So that's how I came to the question. I'm originally from the area, so helping me understand some of the things that I've experienced living there. But
you've just finished this program, this lecture by Noam Chomsky that was delivered in 1989, a long time ago, over 15 years ago. What do you think were the key points that people can learn from this lecture, looking back 15 years, that Chomsky talks about, that are relevant to understanding the conflict today?
Well, I thought it was a very important lecture, still very relevant to understanding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Arab-Israeli conflict for that matter, and more broadly, the US role in the region. Two main things that come to mind that I always felt were generally Chomsky territory, as it were, in trying to understand international relations of the Middle East. One very important dimension of the argument has always been for him to try to understand the main cause of why the US is in the region, why the US came into the region, why the US has been involved in the region since 1940. And I think this has always been his emphasis, that the US is there to control oil. Not to control oil because it needs it, but to control oil because it, using that, tries to determine the policies and the accumulation strategies of its allies, Japan and Europe. So that the world is always looking for, they say the Palestinians don't have a Mandela. Right? This is the time, 1998, when they had a Palestinian Mandela. The Palestinians recognized Israel's right to live in peace and security, very important distinction, not recognize Israel's right to exist, but to live in peace and security. Recognized that, became accepted officially the international consensus over resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which they have implicitly accepted, arguably since 1974, when they accepted to build a Palestinian state on any liberated part of Palestine. This was ratified again in 1988. So the parameters, had the US been interested, and had the Israelis been interested, the parameters for settling or beginning to settle the Palestinian-Israeli conflict were there. This is what the Intifada was about. This is what the 1988 peace overtures were about. And the fact that we're still here now and that this hasn't been accepted just shows you the extent to which Israel is completely a rejectionist of Palestinian right of self-determination. And the Americans have been completely rejectionists of Palestinian right of self-determination as well. This is the significant point at which the conflict could have been over effectively. We're talking 20 years ago, if not before. If only for the fact that Israel and the US don't want it to be over. And that this is another important Chomsky emphasis, and that they are the exception in the world. They have always been the two most important countries who rejected the international consensus over the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So they're outside of the international consensus. Most people in the US believe in that consensus. Most people actually in Israel arguably believe that you can only achieve peace with the Palestinians if you return all of the West Bank and Gaza and dismantle a majority of them. In Gaza, certainly, and in the West Bank, less of a majority, but nonetheless a very significant part of Israelis believe that you have to settle the Palestinian-Israeli conflict by evacuating all the settlements, which are perceived to be illegal. This is what the international consensus is about. So the Chomsky lecture brings us to back to this very important point in 1988 and 1989, when peace could have been achieved again, but wasn't.